Hello, and welcome to my presentation of the American Opportunity Carbon Fee Act, a policy brief presented by Abby Watson. We'll begin with a background on climate change and other climate change policies, proceed on to the structure and objectives of the American Opportunity Carbon Fee Act. Then we will continue on to the political viability of the policy and conclude with an analysis of the future of the policy. Climate change can best be observed using what's known as the Keeling curve. This was established by David Keeling based on his observations of atmospheric carbon dioxide concentrations at his observatory in Mauna Loa, Hawaii, where he began taking measurements in 1958. He observed a strong seasonal variation in the concentration of atmospheric CO2, as well as noted an upward trend in these concentrations over time. He was able to draw a direct link to this upward trend between the burning of fossil fuels and atmospheric carbon dioxide, and he observed that 57% of carbon dioxide emitted from the burning of fossil fuels remains airborne within the atmosphere. This is important because carbon dioxide is a powerful greenhouse gas. What this means is that when incoming radiation from the sun enters our atmosphere, normally it bounces off the surface of the Earth, and a percentage of that radiation returns back into space. Carbon dioxide traps more of this outbound radiation than normally would be trapped, which over time leads to an average increase in our global surface temperatures. Some of the largest sources of carbon emissions include electricity and heating. In fact, 26% of our carbon dioxide emissions globally are produced through the generation of electricity and heat. The United States is responsible for 19% of those global emissions, and it's important to note that that makes us the second most prolific emitter just after China. There's a strong reluctance to take action on climate change policies in a way that would reduce our carbon emissions. Part of this is because some economists have linked rising energy prices to a slowdown of the economy. For example, the chair of the Federal Reserve, Alan Greenspan, issued remarks to this effect in 2001. Here's a good visual representation of the historic greenhouse gas emissions from every nation. And you can see that the United States is responsible for a lion's share of these emissions. In order to combat this issue, there are three primary types of policies that have been used or discussed in the United States. One type is a technology-specific policy, where a policy is set up to benefit some manner of renewable energy technology in the hopes that this technology will displace traditional fossil fuels. Those specific policies include things such as feed-in tariffs, where there is an established rate that utility companies must pay to renewable energy producers, or through tax credits issued to renewable energy facilities or producers, either based on energy produced or on the upfront cost of the installation. Another type of policy is a carbon cap and trade policy, where there's a defined ceiling of total allowable carbon emissions, and then permits are issued to various industries that contribute to these emissions. These industries are then able to trade permits with each other, as some companies are better able to adapt to this ceiling than others. This also presents the opportunity to utilize carbon offsets, which are activities outside of those activities that would normally contribute to carbon emissions, that in fact do the reverse and act as carbon sinks. So this would be something like planting a forest, and this is an area where companies that don't normally contribute to carbon emissions can actually participate in a marketplace that's created by a carbon cap and trade policy. The third type of policy would be a carbon tax policy, which is a very simple concept where there is a price placed on the amount of carbon that's emitted, and this allows market forces to then determine the most efficient way for companies to reduce the amount of tax that they're incurring. And these taxes are usually calculated based on what's known as a social cost of carbon, where economists attempt to capture the total negative impacts that are experienced by all of society through these carbon emissions, and then reallocate those costs back to the original producers. Here's a good visual representation of how a carbon cap and scheme trade typically works, where an industry or a company that's emitting outside of their allowable cap can actually trade and purchase permits from an industry or a company that has done a better job of reducing their emissions, and they have free permits that they don't need for their own uses, so they can sell them to another company. One of the primary legislation policies that's been used to date in the United States to combat climate change is what's known as the production tax credit, or the PTC. This policy benefits the wind industry more than most other industries, and it was first implemented in 1992, and it has been subject to a cycle of expiration and renewal ever since. It's actually expired 7 times since the first implementation. This policy produces $15 billion in private investment every year over the last 5 years just by creating demand for new wind energy capacity. But unfortunately, every time the policy has been allowed to expire, installations of new wind energy capacity have dropped between 76 and 92% every time. Another similar policy is what's known as the investment tax credit, or the ITC. And this policy is a 30% rebate on the cost of installation for renewable energy systems. This rebate is based on taxable income. And I should have mentioned before with the production tax credit, this is a tax credit where a wind energy producer actually receives a certain tax subsidy, also a credit on taxable income, based on the amount of energy that they produce. So the production tax credit is issued based on energy produced. It's currently set at about 2.3 cents per kilowatt hour, and the investment tax credit is a rebate on the cost of installation. Now, another important policy to examine in this regard is the American Recovery and Reinvestment Act. This was an act that was passed by Congress in 2009 in an effort to bring the country out of a very deep recession. And the policy included a number of different provisions related to renewable energy. One of those provisions is that it changed the nature of the investment tax credit to actually be recognized as a cash grant as opposed to a rebate on taxable income, because at the time a lot of these companies that wanted to take advantage of it actually didn't have any taxable income. The other thing that this policy did was it implemented and expanded what's called the Department of Energy Loan Guarantee, where the Department of Energy provides essentially an insurance policy on loans that were issued by banks to renewable energy companies. Here you can actually see the effect of the loan guarantee program and how effective it was. Basically, the loan guarantee is only called in when a borrower defaults on the loan. So Congress had budgeted a certain amount for the expected losses that would be incurred from these loans. And as of the date of this figure, you can see that the current losses experienced were far lower than expected. There are a number of different regional and international policies that also attempt to address the issue of carbon mitigation. One is called the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative, which is a regional cap-and-trade system between a coalition of various states in the northeast of the United States. As of 2014, the collective carbon emissions cap for these states is 91 million short tons of carbon dioxide. This program has been extremely successful and has evolved over time based on the lessons learned from the actual results. An international policy that attempted to address carbon legislation is what's known as the Kyoto Protocol, which was established in 1997 and was intended to be an international accord that would bind participants to various emissions targets. And it also established an international trading system for carbon emissions. However, the United States did not sign this protocol. Here you can see that there are actually a number of regional carbon cap and trade programs available throughout North America, including the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative. Now we get to the American Opportunity Carbon Fee Act. So this is basically a carbon tax where there's a $42 tax per ton of carbon emitted that is levied on both importers and exporters of fossil fuels. So this attempts to capture all of the carbon dioxide emissions for which the US is directly responsible, whether or not we're actually the ones producing the emissions, because you have to remember that the United States is a large producer of fossil fuel exports. The policy includes a 20% target for the reduction of emissions. However, it does not establish a date for that target. Rather than that, it allows the market to set the pace for adaptation. The policy is administered by the IRS, which is a significant advantage for this policy as it does not require the creation of any new government agencies, and in fact utilizes perhaps the most efficient and effective agency in the US government. The objective of this policy is to reduce carbon emissions attributable to the United States, as well as to correct the market failure of carbon emissions. The concept of this market failure is that the atmosphere is what's known as a public good, and fossil fuel burners and producers are damaging this public good to their own profit without having to bear any of the cost burdens that the rest of society has to contend with as a result of their actions. So this now places some of the cost of that damage and that mitigation back onto the people who are actually profiting from it. This also allows market forces to find the most efficient path to carbon mitigation rather than putting the government in the business of choosing winners in terms of technologies. Here you can see that political attitudes toward the legitimacy of climate change actually change based on whether or not there is a free market solution that is currently available for discussion. So the political considerations that we need to think about with the American Opportunity Carbon Fee Act is that it is a tax. Now, this has some advantages and disadvantages. A very popular topic in Congress these days is the idea of tax reform, where both sides of the aisle are interested in making huge changes to our tax code in order to simplify it. This kind of a policy would allow them to eliminate all other energy subsidies in favor of one single streamlined energy policy. It is also revenue neutral, which should appeal to some of the more conservative members of Congress who are averse to the idea of growing the federal budget. Basically, it takes the revenues from the tax and allows a fairly open-ended application of these revenues, including a rebate to individual taxpayers. We also need to consider the partisan issues with a policy such as this. There's currently a Republican majority in both the House and the Senate, which presents a significant challenge towards moving forward any policy related to climate change. However, with the 2016 presidential elections on the horizon, it's entirely possible that the Republican Party could choose to demonstrate leadership by tackling this issue. You also need to consider the special interests that are involved. An advantage of this type of policy is that all of the different special interests within the renewable energy industry could consolidate their forces and combine their resources, as opposed to being divided by pursuing various technology-specific policies. However, compared to the political and financial pull of the fossil fuel special interest group, their strength is considerably weakened facing this foe. There's not a whole lot of public demand and awareness around this issue. It's fairly low on the priority list for the average American who's more concerned with issues related to the economy and national security. Here you can see just how powerful the fossil fuel industry is in regards to lobbying Congress and wielding their financial influence. So this policy was proposed late in 2014, just before Congress changed over to now having a Republican majority in both the House and the Senate. This presents a very difficult legislative landscape throughout 2015 and 2016. The primary focus of Congress in these next 2 years will most likely be to attack two of President Obama's landmark legislation attempts, which are the Affordable Care Act and his executive order on immigration. However, there is bipartisan appeal to the structure and the objectives of the American Opportunity Carbon Fee Act, such as its relation to the greater objective of tax reform, as well as how it relates to national security. Climate change is a growing concern for many of our armed forces in relation to how it affects global security and instability. In conclusion, this policy has a very difficult road ahead, but it's most likely the strongest recent proposal to take action against climate change that's available to Congress today. Hopefully, all of the various special interests that favor this policy will come together and work to produce a workable solution.